The hard part is that nurturing. It's that care to get back to that. It's that human side. It's that development side. It's that teaching and that rehabilitation side. So, are we looking at the outcome? Are we looking at the short-term decision-making, right? A mediation or a sentencing? Are we looking at the long-term outcome? But also, are we being realistic about what we can do with the justice system?
This is RVA Trial Lawyers, Virginia's trial lawyer podcast, hosted by Sharif Gray and Niall Abuzaki.
All right, we're back, RVA Trial Lawyers, and today we've got a good friend and a special guest here, Dr. Brad Lehmann from VCU. Dr. Lehmann, he, for whatever reason, invited Niall and I to come speak to his class last fall. I think the question is still out as to whether or not we were value added or really just a fun distraction for your students. But we had a great time getting to share kind of our background and give them our thoughts on the justice system, both criminal and civil. And at least when I left, it was very clear to me that, Brad, one, you care, which, as Niall and I talk about all the time, the secret ingredient to any good work, especially trial work, is caring. And then two, that what you're teaching is important stuff. And then three, that your students really care about learning and about finding ways that they can get involved to kind of advance justice for everybody. So really excited to have you. Thank you so much for everything that you do for the students at VCU. And with that, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me on. You mentioned value added. Absolutely, it was value added, whether it was the experience going through law school, what you all do, your passion with whether it was the civil trial and some of the stories you were talking about, or it was the victim impact story that you talked about. Those resonated with those students, and they talked about them. But yeah, thank you for having me on. As you said, I'm not a lawyer. I do teach at Virginia Commonwealth University. Professionally, I go by Dr. Brad Lehmann. But I'm fine with just being Brad. That's fine too. But we're part of the L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs at Virginia Commonwealth University, specifically in the Criminal Justice Department. But yeah, thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming on, and really excited to chat with you a little bit more. But before we get into what you're doing now as a professor, let's not forget, you were a police officer. Let's talk about that.
Nice. Yeah. It's interesting, and I know we've chatted a little bit before that academia wasn't necessarily where I saw myself ending back up in, if that makes sense. But, I was a young first generation college student, had no idea even how to navigate a class, back at VCU. And then after an undergraduate degree in criminal justice, I joined the Henrico County Police Department. So, Henrico in that Richmond suburb, huge, busy department, and spent a lot of time, almost a decade as a police officer, whether it was in patrol, whether it was in, courts as the court liaison for Henrico, whether it was, in a specialized, unit doing traffic or doing like narcotics interdiction. And then my last role was as a supervisor. So I was a sergeant in patrol as a first line supervisor on midnight shift.
Henrico is near and dear to my heart, and one of the best divisions in the Commonwealth. So you did that for 10 years. What was the impetus that led you to say, you know what, I want to get back to academia?
Yeah, you know what, that's a wonderful question, and I think a lot of people, are curious about that journey, and I think everyone has their own journey, whether especially criminal justice, whether it's a lifelong police officer, whether it's a lifelong trial lawyer, whether it's a journey that I could maybe ask the same question, like, did you ever see yourself being a judge? Right?
No.
Right. So I had done part of my graduate degree when at Virginia Commonwealth University as well in criminal justice when I joined the police department, and I always had this thought I was going to go back maybe 5 years, like I was going to go back into academia, but I wanted to get some practical experience. And you mentioned Henrico being a wonderful place. Shout out to Henrico County Police Division. I stayed for almost 10 years, and after getting promoted and kind of doing a lot of the things that I wanted to do, field training, teaching in the academy, I kind of caught that bug to go back to academia. So I had finished my graduate degree and made a huge decision to leave a stable position, doing well with the department and for the county, and go back after probably one of the hardest things I've ever done, which was a doctoral, journey, research, didactic coursework, a dissertation, right? All this writing that I would have never thought that I would be able to accomplish, 130-page dissertation with research and all that. But yeah, I mean, I think that experience in justice, both studying it before and then going out and doing it, the practical side, and then coming back into it and seeing it from the academic lens of having both the practice and the academia makes me a pracademic, which is such a cool thing to be able to impart back in, to future studies and future, minded professionals who are trying to get into the field.
Yeah, that's incredible. Makes a huge difference when the teacher has actually been there and done it, right? So when you're talking about search and seizure law, you can, I'm sure, have many stories about what it's like when you have to make that decision. Do I have probable cause to ultimately do this search? Or even more trickier, do I have reasonable suspicion to make that stop, right? And to be able to kind of couple that with the academic side is incredible. And it's something that, frankly, you just don't see that often. I remember when I was looking up your bio for the first time, I was like, wait. PhD, teaches at VCU, but he was a police officer also for however many years. So I think that's got to make it a lot more fun, and I'm sure even more value added to the students.
You called it pragmatic?
Pracademic, like
pracademic.
Practice and academic, right? That was pre-ChatGPT. That was all, research and books. I have an estimate, I kept track the whole time, of almost 2,000 hours of reading, research, then creating the new research, writing the thing, revising anything. Shout out to Dr. Kurt Stemhagen too, if he listens to this, of having to deal with me the whole time and figuring out the revisions to finally get this polished piece of new, we'll call it added. We keep saying value added, like added research to help, future justice-minded people. That look, I did something to help and something to create something new.
Brad, you could have become a pilot for less hours. Just throwing that out there.
Or a podcast host. That's right.
Talking about pracademic, and let's bring that back. And we see it because you do something that I used to appreciate when I was in undergrad at VCU, and that is when you bring practitioners, to come before your students and give them some insight about a day in their life. And in a way, you're shaping and leading these students to these professions. And Sharif and I saw it because we went there and we presented, and we were getting calls a few days later, either for a project or asking us certain questions, or that they can shadow us. There is that passion, and it's more like you're fueling that passion by bringing practitioners. And I know it's not just, us two, but you've also brought politicians and many other individuals. Tell me the value of that for the students that you see from a professor's point of view.
Yeah, I mean, you think about what sticks with you. And for me, as someone who both was in the same, sometimes the exact same classroom and seats with those students, I was there before them. So I remember, doing some of the same studies. And what makes it real is when you hear the authenticity, right? The care, the compassion, the hard work that's being put in, not just what's in, like, let's say a textbook or a reading, or even like what I'm saying, but getting to see, like, I don't know, you all came in for courts and sentencing. Again, shout out to CRGS 324, spring 2025, if they're listening. They had just finished their courtroom work group actors kind of, side. So instead of just reading about prosecutors or reading about the defense attorneys or reading about judges, now they've done it, and now they get to hear and see, someone who's real life working in these fields and ask the questions. And for me, this is where the care side of it comes in, is they get to see themselves, that they could maybe do that one day, especially when they hear, Judge Abazaki say, I was an undergrad in your shoes as an undergrad at VCU, and look, that you can do it too. And that to me goes back to that real role of education, is that it's not just, hey, let me take a quiz, let me take a test or write a paper, but what am I meaningfully getting out of this? And I think that connects back to all the facets of criminal justice, whether it's the academic study side and the research, whether it's the everyday court, proceedings that are happening that sometimes might feel mundane, but are actually a care-based thing. Every single decision is not just, hey, I learned it in a textbook. It's how am I applying it now?
Yeah, and the application's key, right? I mean, every sentencing is a big deal for the person being sentenced, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
and it's not, I mean, for us, it becomes mundane time and again. And sometimes you need those fresh eyes. Not sometimes, you often need those fresh eyes to come and say, all right, okay, I get it. These are the rules. These are the guidelines. This is what's been done here in this jurisdiction. But why? And it sounds like in your role, you're getting to help your students ask why. Like, why do we do this? What's the point? What can be done and make it better? Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely.
And often, Sharif and I, before I took the bench, we would discuss sentencing in general. And one particular aspect of sentencing that we always talked about for a violent crime, when you're sentencing someone at 30 years, what does 30 years do that 28 years doesn't do? And that 2 years to the defendant is a long time. But when you have a prosecutor stand up and say, well, 30 years, well, why not 28? What are you trying to do in those last 2 years? And what haven't the first 28 years have done? And have you thought about that as a professor when you're talking about courts and sentencing? And what a particular sentence, especially when we're just talking about incarceration, what does a particular sentence do that another sentence does not?
So I think that's what's really interesting about, you asked about like the journey, right? So building on experiences, but then also thinking about the humanity, thinking about the people, thinking about not just another case being closed or another case, being disposed of, or another case, whatever you want to call it in the justice system, but who is it affecting, right? Is it affecting the defendant? Like you said, those 2 years to some people might be, what's the difference between 30 and 28 on paper? That's 2 years of a human being's life that the justice system is now, responsible for. Whether it's the defendant who's spending 2 years incarcerated, or whether it's the taxpayers, paying the funding for the justice system to incarcerate that person, or even the question about, does this person need to be incarcerated? So when we talk about sentencing, yes, I want to talk about what the purpose is, right? So when you mentioned criminal procedure earlier, like not just do I have probable cause, what does this actually mean? I'm going into someone's home, I'm searching them, I'm putting my hands in their pocket, I'm arresting them, whatever that is, right? For sentencing, whether we go with the guidelines and let's say you go aggravated, you go higher than what the guidelines come back, or you go below, that's a reason in a situation that's humanistic, right? It's not just something on paper saying this is what we should do or what we can do. It's trying to figure out what the holistic outcome is that's best for all involved.
That's right. And I think, we also want consistency too, which is why I think the guidelines certainly are important, because we don't want a defendant in one part of the state being sentenced in a completely different way than a similarly situated defendant in a different part of the state. But to answer the question of sentencing, thankfully we have a judge on the podcast, so he can tell us everything, all the right answers about how to sentence.
I'm just asking questions.
That's right. But sentencing is very, very difficult. It's very complex. To be able to explore that in a classroom setting, it has to be just fascinating. Time and time again.
I think it really is. And again, you talk about like making a class meaningful, and for some, the week we spend with the mock scenarios that I come up with and put you in groups and say, here are the things that this person's accused of. Here's where let's say they've been convicted in this hypothetical situation. Here's a little bit of their background, and here are the guidelines. Right, here's the upper and the lower, and here's the mid range. And watching, a 300 level university student think through the pros and cons of going to the mid range, right, or going to the higher level, or going down to like the minimum, is a really interesting thing to sit back and watch them think through. Like, oh, I'd want to give this person 20 years because that's the maximum I can give them, and then having their partner say, yeah, but did you think about this in the scenario that maybe their children who were affected in that scenario are not going to see mom or dad for 20 years of their life, whatever that is, right? I think that's that part that seeing the humanity in front of us, right? If I can borrow some stuff from that 2,000 hours of research, seeing the humanity in our decision making, whether it's the prep and the education, or it's the everyday practical work that some of the listeners to everyone is affected by in the world, is that it's not just an outcome on a piece of paper.
That's right.
Right.
It's about the human touch, and human being behind that piece of paper, right? I remember, I think it was Judge Hammond. She was on a earlier podcast with us, probably over a year ago at this point, and I remember her mentioning the story about how one of the things she learned from one of her mentors was to make sure to always write the defendant's name, just to remember that this isn't just another file coming across a desk. This is a human being, and that reminder is just so incredibly important because there's just so many things that go into a sentence. But I want to, if it's okay, I want to dig into a little bit more about that research, and particularly about how like it applies to us. I mean, doing that research and teaching for as many years as you have, what are we as trial lawyers, I guess, what are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? What are the rooms for improvement? Love to get your thoughts.
And I tell you, I think we can apply that to like every service position, whether it's public service or whatnot, is like being reflexive, right? About what are we doing right, but what are we doing? And I don't think it's a secret that a lot of the new generation students and society and future society sees problems, right, with the justice system, sees problems with court. Maybe there's even a distrust in court because of socio-political, right, things that are going on in the world, or we can look at things like disparities, right? But I go back to what you asked about, like, what are we doing right and what we're doing, what could we be doing better? And I think back to, my own time, as a police officer. You said the name, right, that the Judge Hammond said is remembering the person behind the decision making. I think that goes back to balancing the rule of law, or balancing kind of what you mentioned about being accountable and being consistent, with also understanding that we as people all have unique situations, and each, let's say, trial, each representative who has a desired outcome is going to be different each time, every day, even if it's in front of the same judge, if it's the same officer, et cetera, right? And like, how do you recognize that there has to be a balance between, let's say, what the rules say, or what the procedures say, or what the law says, and balancing the needs of the person who might not even know exactly what they need at that time. They just have, let's say, a desired outcome in their mind. And I think that's hard. I think that's really hard.
And when we say needs of the person, I imagine we can expand that from just defendant to witnesses, to victim, to the police officer who spent all night conducting the arrest and doing the booking, right? There's just so many different interests at play.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up, whether it's the victim-centric side of some of the curriculum that I try to bring out, to remember that it's not just, let's say, the accused, or it's not just, say, the criminal trial that you see depicted, or the civil trial you see depicted, but it's the victim, or how about the invisible victims, or the vicarious victims, like the victims that you don't know are impacted by that, right? The children, the family, the society, et cetera, that's around them, but also all the other roles, right? So if I think about, if any of my students end up listening to this, they'll be like, yep, we've heard him say that, a million times. This triangulation of like, I care, you care, and we care. And in a we'll call it in a trial situation, that I care, you care, we care is not just, let's say, plaintiff and respondent, or a defendant and witnesses and accused, but it's all of us that are impacted by that. And I think the understanding that it's a bigger picture than just, let's say, a guilty verdict or a not guilty verdict, but that the long term reaches that it might have on families, children, work outcomes, et cetera. Right? I know there's a lot of studies in adverse childhood experiences now, right? So you are not just talking about, let's say there's a domestic arrest that unfortunately occurs, where in front of the child, right? It's not just the outcome of the sentencing or lack of sentencing, whatever that happens, but it's that long-term impact on the child. So imagine a police officer that understands that every time they step into someone's home in an unfortunate situation like a domestic, that children are watching, neighbors are watching, et cetera. And that sentencing, the procedures that we go through, all of the things change situationally, socioculturally, right? That we all are different. So that is incumbent on you, the professional, to try to identify all those attributes, right?
What we lose sight of is that before the police are called, and we brought up domestic violence, just hearing mom and dad,
right,
going back and forth, it can affect babies as young as 6 months old.
Right.
And we often lose sight of that. But you touched on the invisible victim. As a prosecutor, it's how, every time a prosecutor stands up, they're championing the voice of a victim that's within a community. And it's how does it affect the community as a whole as well? Some community members may not appreciate that a crime was committed. Others do. And that's what you got to take into consideration within that sentence, right? When you come to what is an appropriate sentence. And sometimes a sentence may capture the punishment, but it doesn't capture the future behavior that it changes to a victim. Because a victim may never forget the trauma that a particular defendant may have caused to them. So, that's the thing about sentencing that you have to think about often. And you can have any particular defendant before you, and you look at a defendant, and if a defendant doesn't care about jail time because they've spent 30, 40 years of their life in jail, you ask yourself, hey, am I going to change something by imposing jail? Or should I try to, this person, everyone has given up on him, he's always been thrown behind bars, or should I try to give him a reputation and say, you know what, I believe that you can change. I believe you can do something different. I believe you can pay your child support and make your mother whole, or the mother of your child whole. So there's certain things, and it's interesting when you're, I'll say it from either from the bench or from an academic standpoint, what is an appropriate sentence will depend, even though we want consistency with the guidelines, will depend on a particular person and their story, and solely their story.
And I think that really is kind of emblematic. You asked about the research, and I pulled a lot of work from teaching, a lot of work from we'll call it nursing and or the medical practice on this concept called the ethic of care. And we've all heard this term care before, and most of us who have had any type of training, whether it was practitioner, professional, or whether it's academic, a lot of times gets taught like ethics from a formal or from a practical standpoint, but it doesn't always uplift the care side of things. So how do you do that? How do you adhere to the rules, the order, the law, and also balance that with the needs of, let's say, your client, right? The needs of a victim, the needs of all the people that we are talking about here. So this research, goes into whether it is, we'll call it the one that's caring, the one that's being cared for, or the situation. Those are all three different things, right? Because let's say you have a trial coming up and you have put in all of the time, all of the work, all of the prep work, all of your care, but you've drained your battery, right? Your own internal battery. You might be working on, fumes or 1% of your own internal battery because you're putting out that much care to your case, and you can only be so good if your battery is charged too, right? Or like we mentioned, the technology is working or that you're working properly, right? And at the same time, maybe the person you're representing they don't see how much you put in, or vice versa. You're not putting in the same amount, right? And I don't mean that in whether it's civil or criminal or any type of this. This could be a teacher and student relationship, right? Teacher's not putting in a lot of work, and the student sees that, right? How do we mirror and or uplift so that we triangulate our compassion for our work, right? But also our realistic balance for our work at the same time. How do we take care of ourselves and take care of the needs of our client? How do we take care of this situation and get a desired outcome that maybe is balanced for all parts, whether it's the law, social order, whether it's the needs of not just the victim, but the people who are all impacted by the victimization there. I think there's a lot to this, right? But we don't get taught, or we don't get as many opportunities to think about that in a lot of times our training, because we are taught to follow policies or procedures, or we even default back to, well, that's the way it works, right? That's the way the rules work, or that's what the procedure says I have to do. Or if you even think about like how much time do you get to spend thinking about these things, right? Thinking about the greater impacts of our decisions. Were they taught to you in your ethics classes? Were they taught to you in your own upbringing, right? When we all have a different way that we bring our decision making. So exploring that, of not devaluing, let's say, what all of this work has done to create law and order or to create a rule of law, but how do we uplift that extra piece, that part that says, do I need to make this, arrest? Do I need to ask for this verdict? Do I need to settle, right, for this amount during mediation, right? I think I saw something recently about a mediation issue, right? What happens if the other side of a civil issue is just trying to lowball, but your client needs more, or it's asking for more, their justice is actually, more. Can you speak more on that?
Yeah, that was a recent mediation that did not go as expected. The sexual assault case, and it's an active case, so obviously I won't talk too much about it, but we drove up to DC ready to mediate this case, and the other side, and they did not negotiate in good faith, unfortunately, and it was disappointing.
So the question is, what factors do you consider to try to get to a just result?
That is,
it's the eye of the beholder, right?
To some
extent,
what I'm saying,
right?
So for Sharif, he may say, "Hey,
right,
they did not negotiate in good faith."
Yeah, they're probably back there saying the exact same thing about me, right?
So that's the question. So what factors do you consider to get to justice? What factors do they consider to get to justice? And what factors should be considered to get to justice?
I was going to date myself with a little reference there and say that's the $64,000 question, right? Like that's what we're getting at. And I think if we are creating opportunities, especially for those who, in my field, who we're teaching or we're trying to expand not just what a book knowledge says or what ChatGPT says or Copilot, right, whatever, but what the practical and realistic implications of a decision is, maybe we are actually working towards a little bit more just decisions. But you're right? Like, how do I know what shoes you've walked in and what you see as the optimal outcome versus what I see as the optimal outcome? And it goes back to not just, we'll call it, formal ethical decision-making training, but how you were raised, where you came from, what your cultural norms are, what your experience is, right? We can get into morality here. We can get into, we can go back to Socrates and Plato. We can go into, Kantian ethics if you want, and go to this, like, do we have good out of our systems? Are our decisions doing good? Or we can just go back to who we are and where we're coming from and what we believe is best. And how do we convey that to, let's say, who we're representing? Or for me, how do I convey that I care when I'm up, yammering on, in a class, that this isn't just another, assignment, or this isn't just another book you're reading to get a piece of paper degree. This is real life learning and knowledge that has future implications to it, that is going to come up in your life, whether it's in your professional field or not. And I think that's the same thing, whether we're thinking about criminal trial, we're thinking about civil trial, we're thinking about, I even think like accepting a plea deal, right? I know there's been a lot on the news, a lot of high profile cases talking about plea deals recently and whether or not a victim or victim's family thought that was justice or not. So I think this is a broader thing: is are we creating opportunities for people and ourselves to not just learn how to apply and to think about our decision making, but also be reflexive and think about our decision making as we're doing it and after the fact, right? So like before, during, and after. And that's a hard thing because our lives are busy.
That's right. And I'm thinking when I hear you talk about this, what I see in my mind is the busy courtroom, right? I see the prosecutor, I see the defense attorney, I see the judge, the court staff, people coming in and out and cases being called. And there just isn't, at least now, it's not common to find the time to really sit back and say, well, what are we doing and why are we doing it? And that's not a criticism. It's just the way that the system is set up is just one in which it just doesn't account for that, right? And I don't necessarily think that's necessarily just specific to the legal profession. I mean, you can probably make the same criticism almost any profession.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And Sharif, I'll tell you, one, I used to practice as a prosecutor. If I make an offer that the defense attorney kind of nods his head and says, I understand why you're asking for this. And then we put it up before the judge and the judge kind of nods his head as well and says, that sounds reasonable. That's when I start to tell myself, okay, I am starting to appreciate the value of a case because you have three humans and three different roles all nodding their head together. It's how do you get there? And often when I am working with younger prosecutors and I see that they're on opposite ends of the spectrum with the defense attorney and then the judge rejects a plea, then I'm like, there's a disconnect there. And what is that disconnect? And it's usually, you touched on it, a humanistic lack of appreciation for the effects of this recommendation or agreement that's being presented to the court.
And it could be on either side, right?
Oh, like, yes.
Yeah, not just the impact of the defendant, but also not impact necessarily, but let's think about the victim. Let's think about the community in the case. One thing that you said now a while back that I have not forgotten, and I think it's a very, very good insight. But let's take like a robbery, right? Or someone steals something from a house in a neighborhood. It's not just impacting that one home, that one family. Now you see, as you said a while back, you see neighbors, they're buying special cameras to put on their doors, right? Like suddenly they're making sure their cars are locked, double checking their doors at night to make sure they're locked. I mean, those are also arguably victims.
They're going to invest either in a firearm or a security alarm system. You're exactly right. I mean, there is a ripple effect. And the question becomes, what do you do to that? How do you encompass that within? And for example, petty larceny cases, when you stand up as a prosecutor and they're like, oh, well, we just stole from Walmart and Target. It's just Walmart and Target. Well, Walmart and Target are in business. And when you're in business, if you're not making profit, you're not going to be in business because the business is going under. So if they do have that loss, and it's a great loss, and we're talking about billions of dollars of loss a year, guess who's paying for that loss? It's getting spread to the consumers. And who are the consumers? They're the community. They're the community that is, in a way, in the blind side.
What?
And that's what you got to understand. That's, it's that profit. Business is not going to lose that profit. The other prices are going up. If you have a police officer, who's paying for that police officer? Yeah, the customers. The security camera, the loss prevention officer, the customers. So you always argue that it's not a simple larceny. It's a greater larceny, and you want both the prosecution, you want both the defendant, and you want the judge to appreciate that.
Let me ask, are we asking, actually this is a really good question for you, Dr. Lehmann, I hope. Are we asking too much with the criminal justice system in some sense?
So I think you hit on it, right? Like, and I'm so glad that we meandered our way into victim rights, victimology, which is, another one of my fields. And the balance here with what we were talking about earlier with like care and understanding that it's not just, let's say, the policies and the outcome, but it's also the people and you and us together is that I care, you care, we care, right? So, you mentioned the busy, hectic courtroom, and I get flashbacks to how much time I spent in busy, hectic courtrooms. I think about the humanistic side, the humanity, right, that's sitting in front of you, or that you yourself that's participating in it. So let's say it's somebody new to this that's the first time in a court, whether they are a victim, maybe they're an observer, right? They're a student that I'm asking them to go do a court observation or something like that. But it's busy because it's humanity, right? So what is the justice system doing that is helping humanity as opposed to causing more harm to it, right? So, and I do agree, if you're not helping, you're harming, right? There may be a net neutral right in there or something like that. But, those courtrooms feel hectic. And I don't have to speak to it. You all are in court all the time, right? So I think, this victim side of thing also balances back to what are we asking the justice system to do? And a lot of times, whether it's the first time in a college class that an undergraduate student has to think about this, the light bulb starts to go off. Is it a criminal justice system? Is it a civil justice system? Who is it designed for? Who is it working for? And when you can sometimes say, and a lot of times say, it's not working for, let's say, victims, or it's not working for, the greater society, but at the same time, it is. It's working to its fullest extent. It's overwhelmed with, legal, challenges. It's overwhelmed with legislative challenges. It's overwhelmed with appeals, or, I know recently, in the last couple of years, you got the split sentence, right, where you can have judge and jury, right, in a trial. Are we pushing the system to an extent that it's at a capacity, or it's getting overwhelmed? And guess who's being forgotten about? The humanity, right? Whether it's the people that are working in the system or those who are affected by it. So I think a lot of sometimes we see the research where someone is distrusting of the police. Okay. And there's lots of reasons to be distrusting of police, but there's lots of reasons to be trusting of police, right? You can almost extend that and look at some of the more current research that talks about the trust in the courts or the distrust in the courts. And each one of those goes back into how that trial or how that case had an impact, not on just the person, but on society. So, I know we've had some major cases, in the area that have made, a lot of news. Do you trust the outcome of your local prosecutor in handling a major case, right? Depending on the county, depending on the locality, depending on the type of charge or who is facing a charge, that might increase the belief that the justice system is working and can increase its capacity and change. Or you see an outcome that affects your belief in whether or not the courts are actually working for you, which impacts all of us, right? I want to believe that my police are there for me. And if I call, as a city of Richmond resident, if I call 911, that the police will be there. And I also want to believe that if I either, whether I violate the law or I'm a victim of law, or a victim, of a crime, that the courts are going to work for me and the corrections are going to work for me and the sentencing, right? It's all connected. But this bigger question I think you asked, and I'll turn it back over, is it working? And I think that's a one for all of us to think about that are, whether it's trial or studying or whatever it is this working? If it's not, what can we do about it?
I'll tell you what, when hearing you talk about that, the thing that pops into my mind, and I remember when I was working at Henrico as a prosecutor, the cases where, let's say, the defendant has been charged and it's fairly clear that they are guilty of, I don't know, take a petty larceny, so a small-time theft. The defendant, however, has a number of mental health issues, so much so that they're not even competent to stand trial. We can't necessarily say, all right, you don't have a charge anymore, go on your way, right? At the same time, we can't move the case forward. And I just remember this feeling of like helplessness, and not just on my part, but like on the part of the defense attorney, on the part of the judge. Because what do you do? I mean, it's almost like the criminal justice system is thrown with this issue that it just doesn't have the tools to really resolve. So
it's adapting. So when you have a void, you're going to have people stand up to try to fill that void. And our biggest void is appreciating mental health. That's we're always about 10 to 15 years behind. And we know that because of the books that we use to diagnose, right? They're one where they were in and they're being used today to diagnose. But the thing is, yes, so if you put them back out without going to the root of the issue, have you taken part in future victimization? And I'm talking about from a prosecutor's perspective, because you haven't gone to the root of the issue. And this person is going to be back in the community, and that person is going to victimize someone else in the community. So you got to ask yourself, as a prosecutor or even as a judge, what have I done to administer justice here? And if I just put a Band-Aid on, and as soon as they're done with their sentence, the Band-Aid is off, but I didn't treat the wound, what have I done? Did I administer justice? And was I a minister of justice as a prosecutor? That's a couple of things that you got to keep in mind.
Yeah, and did you advance the ball, right? Like
And
forward for everyone. And this story is a little funny and also exposed kind of my ignorance when I first started out. I remember, so the first time petty larceny, right? Oftentimes eligible for a first offender, right? And I remember for shoplifting cases, there was, as a part of the agreement to do first offender, there was this like shoplifting course and one had to take it. And I remember asking, I was like, oh, that's awesome. Do they like sit them down and talk about like their financial struggles and kind of determine like, well, what led to ultimately you making the decision that you needed to steal from this place? And then I learned later on, like, no, it was nothing about that. It's not about finding the root. It's like an online course or a thing they show up for a couple hours and they check the box and then move on. I'm like, well, that doesn't really make much of a difference. But that maybe comes back to what we were talking about earlier, Brad, about like, are we giving the criminal justice system too much?
So
I mean,
yeah,
especially when the fixes a lot of the times, right, are like,
Costly. It's way more costly.
well, and they're not something that really the players in the criminal justice system have anything to do with, right? I mean, education, jobs, health, right? Like,
But if it's to administer justice, and you got to look at justice both for community as a whole and to this particular person, then you have a duty. Look, we live in the greatest country on earth. And to be the greatest country on earth, you got to do great things. And because we should continue to do great things for those that need it, that need that intervention.
I love that we're talking about right justice, and we're talking about the bigger multi-systemic connection here, right? And I want to mention a couple things, if we have time, is that the justice system is not the only system that's usually impacted or being impacted by these actions, right? You mentioned mental health. I think about substance abuse. I think about Richmond and our housing crisis and our unhoused populations, right? I think about all of these things, our socioeconomic differences. I think about our cultural differences. I think about, the systemic racism in the United States that maybe led into, let's say, redlining in a neighborhood, which has created an issue with long-term over-policing or lack of structural care for an area that might, let's say, be ripe for victimization or ripe for, criminality, but is also being asked to, we'll put it this way, being asked to be solved by the criminal justice system. When these are systemic issues that are landing in the laps of the justice system. So it's the police officer responding to that shoplifting, right? But that might not be only a justice, like did somebody know that they were doing, the crime, mens rea actus reus type stuff, or is this a bigger systemic issue? So I think about that, and then what we ask the justice system to do. As a former police officer, I can tell you, if I went back and let's say I kept diligent notes on every call, that the majority of calls that I was getting were not just crime related, right? They were social services stuff. TDOs, whether it was responding to mental health, whether it was responding to, I don't know, my son won't go to school call. all the way to the things that plague, our systems. Someone's asking for help, right? Or someone is not getting the help from a system, and that is falling in the lap of now the justice system. So that's one. And then you talk about what are we doing about it? And I smiled a little bit when you mentioned the shoplifter class, because I think about driving school. And I'm not going to pick on driving school because I think we all could probably work on our driving a little bit. But
everyone in my office thinks that I can work on my driving. Actually, I went home a few weeks ago. Well, I go home every day. But anyways, I went home and I remember telling my wife, I said, you know what? My colleagues think I'm just not that great of a driver. And she goes, well, I'm glad I'm not the only one.
It's not you. It's a Tesla.
It's the Tesla. That's
Tesla.
right. Damn Elon Musk. Yeah, that's right. Sorry.
Yeah,
so as somebody who has been to driving school, it's been a while, but as a form of sentencing or punishment, it goes back to what we're talking about. Like, it felt more of a time and retributive punishment rather than a rehabilitative, right, or a learning piece, right? And I preach this in these classes when we talk about the rationales of punishment, right? Are we just trying to be retributive? Are we trying to create a deterrent factor? Are we trying to incarcerate? Because we can lock people up, we can fine them. That's like one of the easiest things to do in lots of punishment. You think about even like parental. I'm not a parent, but think about like raising a child. I mean, you can ground a child, right? That's very easy, right? Sometimes you can be retributive. Some people believe in corporal punishment and all that, but the hard part is that nurturing. It's that care to get back to that. It's that human side. It's that development side. It's that teaching and that rehabilitation side. So, are we looking at, going back to kind of the concept of the discussion today, are we looking at the outcome? Are we looking at the short-term decision-making, right? A mediation or a sentencing? Are we looking at the long-term outcome? But also, are we being realistic about what we can do with the justice system? Can the justice system fix driving? And I'll stop on this. I always joke with driving is what grade would you give traffic? And people will be like, oh, I don't know, an F, a D plus. And I'll be like, well, what grade would you give you as a driver? And that varies, right? So we have a disconnect with that. But what's the realistic level that you would be acceptable? Like if we had a C plus with driving in society, we'd be a lot better society.
Brad, I'll tell you, I believe justice can go to the root if you do it right. And I'll give you a simple example. I had a young man, 18 years old, came to courtroom number 5, Henrico County General District Court, 4 unlawful entry misdemeanor charges under 18.2-121. There is no first offender. We didn't have 19.2-298.02, which allows you to take particular charges under advisement then. Mm-hmm. The question before me was like, man, this guy just breaking into these different homes. It's not a breaking and entering because he wasn't going in to steal.
Right.
He needed a place to sleep when it was freezing cold at night. So the question then became, well, now what do you do? I remember, defense counsel brought up, I give defense counsel credit. No, this guy needs help. And I was like, well, we're going to help him. What the criminal justice system did, and what this 4 charges did, it incentivized him. He had an ultimatum. Either you go to jail or I continue this. You go to the Department of Social Services. You get a job. You let them find you placement, temporary housing. That's what I did. I continued this case out for 6 months with direction. And then one day, I go to my parents' Dairy Queen to do the taxes and royalties, which I do.
And I'm sure you had some ice cream too.
Oh, always.
I was already thinking about a blizzard. Yep.
Yeah.
And as I walk in, guess who was on the front line? That particular person who had a pending case before me. He was given a job at one of our restaurants, and he was shocked to see me, and I was glad to see him with a big smile on my face. And then he ran into the office. I was sitting down. He's like, "Can you please not tell anyone about how we know each other?" I was like, "Of course not." I was like, it made it seem like I still don't even know him. But what am I saying? It's the system and the punishment that he was facing was the incentive
Right.
to kind of get him on the right path. And he worked for over a couple of years for my family, and then decided he wants to go to school, and now he is a productive member of our community. But if, as a prosecutor, as a defense attorney, or as the court, if you just threw him in jail and ordered restitution for the damage to the doors because he'd break the doors, what have you really done? We armed him to be a successful member of our community. And what you've done here, not only did you serve justice to this young man, but you also served it to that apartment complex. Because if we didn't arm him with the resources to succeed, he would have came back to the apartment complex that he knows best, where he can actually walk in and have a roof over his head. And it's that apartment complex, and bring in the property manager and the owner. So, yes. Are we asking too much, Sharif? Yes, but we are up for the ask. You do live in the greatest country on earth.
That's
We're
right.
up for the ask. And I know you appreciate that better than anyone.
Well, I mean, what am I hearing when you're saying that? I'm hearing a story about someone who cared, right? And that kind of comes right back to what this
Full
entire
circle.
conversation is about. It's in that moment with that case, you cared about making a difference. And you were able to use the criminal justice system in a way that kind of incentivized that person to better themselves. And I mean, Henrico started a veterans court recently, and Chesterfield has one. There's the drug court.
Orbit, right,
There's
yeah.
all types of programs and diversion programs and all that to incentivize people and to try and help people to get out of the situation that they're in. So by no means are we not trying. We certainly are. But man, is it hard, right? And then
And we're not perfect.
Yeah, and we're not perfect.
And
I mean,
it burns that battery down too, right? I mean, I think it's really interesting in a dualistic manner that we have the justice system that has the power, right, to do what you said, right? The power to maybe help solve issues that really should have nothing to do with the criminal justice system, right? Like the gentleman you're talking about, that really should have never been in the criminal justice system. But the unfortunate reality, right, of are we doing too much, or can we do more, or are we at our limits, is that sometimes it takes someone being in the net widening, to use the academic term, right, the arms of the justice system to get them to the help, which is another bigger question for systemic society, right, is why is it that we have to ask the police, the courts, the jails. You mentioned the veterans courts. You mentioned, I think I threw out their Orbit. Shout out to Orbit program and Henrico. HARP and the amazing things HARP is doing. In Chesterfield in the jail, right? But that's what we mean by justice, right? How are we getting to the root causes of criminogenic tendencies? In this case, the gentleman's criminogenic tendencies was what all of us want. What we should have right to is shelter, right, or a warm place to say, I don't want to sleep. Right, out in the cold in the winter. I could see myself, if we're going back to the humanity side of it, if I was in that situation, understanding where that person was coming from. Am I excusing the behavior? No. But if I was freezing, I might break in somewhere too, right? So where you can take one case at a time, one trial at a time, in my case, one student at a time, or just one person who wants to listen, right, and talk and have a conversation. By the way, beautiful conversation. This is amazing, right, between three people who want to do better, right? And help solve a realistic, real-life human issue, right? In this case, housing, or like you mentioned earlier, mental health, substance abuse. I firmly believe in the majority of substance abuse issues that end up on the police's doorstep are not only, right, because somebody is choosing to be a criminal, right? I'm using the air quotes, a criminal to do drugs. Sometimes there's more to that, right? So what are we doing to treat the underlying, issues here? And that to me is real justice. And if that has us and gives us the ability to get people out of the criminal part and get us back into the justice part, I'm all for it. But it's unfortunate that we have to sometimes rely on the courts or rely on the police or rely on the jails to be that thing that gets them to that treatment.
we've got some incredible people doing that work, though. And
Absolutely.
and actually, Niall and I were talking about this not long ago. It's like the same type of person who's attracted to serve, to join the military, or is the same type of person that you see wearing the badge, right? Serving as a police officer, serving in the prosecutor's office, or serving as a public defender, or with the courts, or with the fire department, right? It's these people who want to be a part of something bigger than themselves. And I mean, certainly as a society, I think we could do a better job when it comes to compensation, right? I mean, it's this problem we've had for years. We don't pay our teachers enough. We don't pay our public servants enough. But we are, I think, indebted to the goodwill of just so many incredible people who are willing to go out there day and day again to try and do better for the community. And so it's really incredible. If you could go back in time to when you were graduating from the police officer academy, what would you tell yourself, knowing everything you know now?
Talk about a good question. Oh, I love it. Giving advice, or just something I would want to know. I love this idea of giving advice to your younger self, if you could just like pop back in time.
I would love to do it to myself, but I know I also wouldn't listen to myself either.
Absolutely. I'd be like, who's this guy? Get out of here.
Right.
No, you know what? I think it goes back to I'm laughing here because I heard people tell me this. Slow down. Slow it down a little bit. Don't go too fast. Don't try to do too much, but put that effort that you would be putting in. We'll call it like quality over quantity, right? That effort that you might have put in to do 5 things, right? Put that full effort into 1 full thing, right? Or 2 full things. Don't overextend yourself, both because the detriment is going to be to yourself and to those who you're trying to help. And most importantly, in my opinion, to your family and to your wellness, right? So that balance of care, that balance of wellness, that balance of all the things we do, we're only as good to ourselves as we allow ourselves to be. And then we can only be as good to the people that we're trying to help as we have the capacity, right? And all of us have a different level of battery. So I would say to the 22-year-old new police officer back in the day, you don't have to work all that off duty. You don't have to work, overtime all the time. You don't have to, burn the candle at both ends. Go home, rest a little bit, go on that extra vacation. Shout out to the police officers who might be listening to this. Use that time off that you have. Don't lose it, right? Take that time to refresh. So that would be my advice to myself. Slow down a little bit.
I'm thinking about Trevor Holmes, right? Go take that time off, Trevor. Stop pulling me over. Anyways.
Can I add something real quick?
Of course.
I pulled Trevor Holmes over.
No way.
Before he was a police officer.
All right.
So
before he was a police officer.
Before he was a police officer.
Now he's reformed, right?
So just saying, see how it goes full circle, right? So he pulled you over, I pulled him over. So
that's right. One day he'll actually show up to a podcast episode, I hope.
It'll be a good one. But yeah, that's great advice. And I really appreciate you all having me on. And, I think it's that reflexive side is what I value. So, if somebody wants to spend an hour, hopefully listening to RVA Trial Lawyers podcast and gets something out of our discussion today, that's paying it forward, right? And I appreciate you giving me, a platform to talk.
We appreciate you, and mainly because you care.
Try.
Thank you, Brad.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of RVA Trial Lawyers, Virginia's trial lawyer podcast. For more episodes, check out rvatriallawyers.com.